Please, spare my people, Jacek.
They called him slave. By the third rising of the violet sun, their queen would kneel before him and beg. Jacek Marwick woke to a sky the color of a bruise. Two pale suns hung low over a forest of glowing mushrooms taller than any building he'd ever seen. The air was thick enough that every breath felt like a weight in his chest, and it hummed faintly, like a sound he could feel more than hear. He was chained to a slab of black stone. His throat was raw, and somewhere close by, in a voice that didn't come through his ears but seemed to vibrate straight through his ribs, someone said one word. "Slave." He tried to answer. Nothing came out but dust and a fine yellow pollen from his cracked lips. The voice spoke again, closer now, almost amused, and the metal at his wrists went cold, like it had just been breathed on. That was how he learned the truth about the people of this world. They didn't speak with sound. They spoke with scent, chemistry so rich that a single breath could carry an entire hymn. To them, Jacek was a deaf man standing in the middle of a cathedral, so they gave him the only name they had for something that couldn't hear: slave. He was a scientist, not a soldier. He'd been out on the rim collecting samples for a university that barely paid his fuel bill when a solar storm tore the antenna off his ship and dropped him out of the sky. He walked for 3 days before the ground opened beneath him and gentle amber hands pulled him under. Now he knelt, or was made to kneel, in a chamber carved from the inside of an ancient mushroom in front of a queen. Her eyes weren't eyes at all, just two pools of pale gold. Every time she gave an order, a faint ring of light rippled out from her like a heartbeat, and everyone it touched obeyed. This was her empire, not built from stone or steel, but from scent, a shared grief, a shared calm, a mind that belonged to everyone and no one. Her name, as close as it could be translated, was Kael'ithya. When she looked at Jacek, she smelled nothing, no grief, no memory, no signature at all. To her, he wasn't just foreign. He was empty. So she called him the only word her language had for that: slave. He didn't know it yet, but that emptiness was about to become the most dangerous thing in her entire empire. He learned quickly that a bowed head kept a man alive long enough to learn the rules. He was put to work crushing glowing fungus the Vaelkiri used to send messages across the stars, and the overseers stung him whenever he slowed down. He didn't slow down as often as they expected. He was tired down to the bone, but his hands kept moving, because somewhere in the tunnels below was a child who needed him more than he needed rest. Her name, as close as he could say it, was Anteri. She was small even for her kind, and every year the Vaelkiri put their children through the memory-rite, a test where each child had to recall, in perfect chemical detail, a full generation of their ancestors' grief. Anteri kept failing. He watched the overseers mark her wrist with a pale ring, the mark of a child who, if she failed again, would be buried in the deep soil to feed the very fungus her people had come from. That night, Jacek did the only thing he knew how to do. He took the last piece of bread he'd been hiding since the crash, broke it into 7 small pieces, and left them by her sleeping mat. He didn't know if bread was even food to her kind. He just knew a hand offered quietly, at the right moment, was a language every living thing already understood. By morning, the bread was gone. He had no way of knowing it, but that one small piece of bread had just started a clock running, and everyone in the hive, including the queen, was about to hear it tick. Over the weeks that followed, he pieced together how the hive really worked. The queen's scent reached every one of her people at once. It kept them calm, kept them obedient, kept them from grieving too hard or wanting too much. Stray too far from it, and a Vaelkiri would slowly lose their sense of who they were. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was closer to farming. He understood, too, why they feared him. His body simply couldn't read her chemistry, some accident of being born on a different world entirely. He'd stood beside her throne and felt nothing. He'd held Anturi's hand and felt nothing back but the warmth of her small fingers. He was the one creature in her empire she couldn't reach. That frightened her more than any weapon. So she watched him. She watched him break the bread into 7 pieces instead of 1. She watched him fold fungus fiber into something soft enough to be a pillow. And one night she watched him sing. It was an old lullaby, the one his own daughter used to fall asleep to before the fever took her. His voice was rough and small, nothing like the rich chemical songs of this world, but Anturi laughed when she heard it. What came off her small body, and she laughed was something the overseers had never measured before, bright, warm, with no name in their language. A slave was teaching a child a new kind of weather, and somewhere above them, on a throne of petrified stone, the queen had just started asking herself a question her empire had never allowed. What if the old rule was wrong? One night he followed a strange, broken sound down into the deepest part of the hive. There he found one of the elders, one of the 12 who judged the memory-rites, kneeling alone in the dark. Her body had gone pale, and a thin thread of grief was pouring out of her chest, drifting up into the fungus above. She'd been doing this every night, he realized, for decades. The hive fed on grief. The elders had spent their whole lives feeding it, because no one had ever taught them how to feed it anything else. He thought about his own daughter, about the small blanket he used to fold and refold in his hands in the months after she was gone. Grief, he understood then, isn't so different anywhere in the universe. It's a kind of weather, and weather doesn't care who it falls on. But he had no idea he was about to be tested by that weather himself in front of the whole hive, with Anturi's life on the line. Weeks later, the memory-rite came again. Anturi knelt in the circle while 12 elders released their slow streams of ancestral scent until the chamber glowed like a cup of honey held to the sun. She was supposed to breathe it in and recite, note for note, the grief of 6 generations before her. Instead, what came out of her was his lullaby. The room went cold. The elders recoiled. The queen rose from her throne for the first time Jacek had ever seen, a ring of amber light rolling out across the floor, turning the stone gray wherever it touched. 4 guards stepped forward with long, humming lances. They were going to take Anturi to the deep soil. Jacek didn't think, he just moved. He stepped into the circle between the guards and the child, and he opened his mouth and sang. His daughter's lullaby, in a cracked human voice, in a palace built entirely on scent and silence. Anturi lifted her head and sang with him. 2 broken voices, both wrong by every rule of this world, both somehow still singing. The queen could have ended it in a heartbeat, one wave of her hand, one breath of the binding scent, and it would have been over, the way it had been over so many times before. Instead, for the first time in 1,000 years, she lowered her hand. And she listened. Not to the song exactly, to him, to the strange, silent creature who had no place in her world and had somehow written a new note into it anyway. For one breath, her own field faltered. In that single breath, every Vaelkiri under her canopy lifted their head at once. It lasted only a second, but a second was enough. The workers remembered the bread, the overseers remembered the pillow, the children in the creche remembered being sung to. A whole civilization remembered, for one breath, a kindness the hive had never approved. That memory didn't go away, and memories like that don't stay quiet for long. Anturi wasn't buried that day. She also wasn't forgiven. The mark stayed on her wrist. She would face the right one more time, and next time no one would step in. So Jacek taught her a second language. He built a small light out of broken pieces of his old equipment and taught her to answer the old grief instead of just repeating it, to breathe in the ancestral scent and send something new back out. Not sorrow, something of her own. A note the hives had never carried before. There was only one problem. The queen was watching every single day of that training, and Jacek still didn't know what she planned to do about it. When the third rising of the violet sun came, Anteri knelt in the circle one last time. She breathed in the old grief. What she sang back wasn't the worker's sorrow or his exile. It was something entirely new, bright, cool, and deep, like the smell of rain on warm stone. Anteri passed the rite. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a sound rolled through the chamber that the hive hadn't carried in living memory: laughter. Not human laughter, but laughter all the same, rippling out in overlapping rings that made the amber light dance. Somewhere far off on her throne, Kael'ithya felt it too. A single bead of pale sap rolled from the corner of her eye and fell against the stone. Where it landed, the stone bloomed. Anteri was safe, but the hardest part of this story hadn't happened yet, because an empire doesn't change because one child sings a new song. It changes when the person at the top decides to kneel. In the days that followed, the great flowering towers that carried the queens sent across the hive began, quietly, to wither, not from disease, but because the workers had started choosing what they sent out into the air instead of simply obeying. 4. The first time in 1,000 years, the hive's council convened, elders, workers, and children together, in a chamber that had been sealed for generations. One night, with no one watching but the memory that would later carry the story, Kael'ithya walked down from her throne and knelt in the lower tunnels beside the sleeping child with the pale mark on her wrist. She breathed out one long, slow note that smelled of rain. She wasn't a queen in that moment. She was only a mother, kneeling before the child she had almost let the old rule take from her. "Forgive me," she said. It was the first time in 1,000 years the hive had carried that word at all. But forgiveness from a queen doesn't erase 1,000 years of rule on its own. She still had one more thing to ask, and this time she'd have to ask the one person in her empire she couldn't order around. Jacek was brought before her, hungry, unwashed, barely standing. The queen was still kneeling. She looked at him with her golden eyes, and for the first time the word she gave him wasn't an order. It was please. He looked past her through a gap in the stone, at the violet sky finally starting to clear. He thought about his ship, buried somewhere in the forest above. He thought about his daughter. He thought about how strange it was that a man with no weapons, no rank, and no way to call for help could end up standing in the throne room of an alien empire and not be killed for it. He didn't kneel. He walked to the throne, set his hand on the cold stone beside her, and said the only thing he had left to say, the same words he'd been singing all along, just without the tune. "You're not alone. You never have to be." Anteri's new song rose up from the lower tunnels and spread through the hive, answered by 1,000 voices that had never been allowed to sing before. Above them, the fog finally lifted. Both violet suns broke through at once, and the light falling across 1 billion small bodies looked, for the first time in 1,000 years, like something worth waking up for. Kael'ithya never sat on her throne the same way again. The canopy didn't close. It didn't need to. The rule had already changed, not because anyone tore it down, but because a slave, a broken man who'd lost everything except the habit of kindness, had shown an empire what its own mothers had always known. No child should have to earn the right to be loved. The Vaelkiri don't call him slave anymore. They never did again. They call him Dedal, the one who wouldn't stay silent while the silence was killing them. In every third rising of the violet sun in the lower tunnels, an old queen still kneels at a small stone bench in front of a tired man with cracked hands and asks him, in the same old prayer her people had forgotten for 1,000 years, for mercy. And he gives it the way he always has. Without condition, without end.